Dawn broke over Fort Bragg like a reluctant confession. The North Carolina sun struggling through morning mist that clung to the earth with the persistence of old secrets. The training compound sprawled across terrain that had witnessed generations of American warriors, their boots wearing paths into red clay, their sweat seasoning the obstacles, their determination leaving imprints that no amount of rain could wash away. This was hallowed ground in its own way, not sanctified by priests or politicians, but consecrated by the simple fact that men and women came here to be forged into something harder than they'd been before. The pines stood watch along the perimeter like silent witnesses to transformation and failure, to triumph and washout, to the endless cycle of testing that separated those who could from those who thought they could. Through the pre-dawn darkness, a figure moved along the obstacle course with mechanical precision. Female, early 20s, her ACU already dark with sweat despite the cool air. She attacked the rope climb with determined fury, hands raw from repeated attempts, legs trembling from exhaustion that went bone deep. At the base of the obstacle, two men watched with a detached assessment of predators studying wounded prey. Master Sergeant Declan Thorpe stood with arms crossed over a chest decorated by years of hard service. At 45, his body carried the accumulated damage of 2 decades in special operations. A Fallujah scar that ran along his jawline, a knee that announced weather changes before any meteorologist, hands that had pulled triggers in 12 countries across 4 continents. His face was a topographical map of conviction, every line carved by certainty about how the world should work. Beside him, Sergeant First Class Owen Briggs maintained the permanent squint of a man who'd spent too many years looking through rifle scopes. 42 years old, Afghanistan veteran, loyal to Thorpe with the kind of unquestioning devotion that built both elite units and dangerous conspiracies. The candidate reached for the rope again, muscles screaming protest. Her fingers slipped. She crashed to the mat for the 4th time in 20 minutes. Thorpe's voice cut through the morning air with surgical precision. "Hit her harder, she's weak." He turned to Briggs, not bothering to lower his voice. "They all are. No amount of political correctness changes biology." Briggs nodded, making notes on his evaluation clipboard. "That's number 37, Sergeant. Want me to process the washout paperwork?" "Standard protocol. Failure to meet physical requirements." Thorpe's tone carried the weight of absolute certainty. "We're not running a social experiment here. We're building warriors." The candidate staggered to her feet, pride wrestling with the reality of complete physical depletion. She knew what came next. They all did. The conversation that began with, "We appreciate your effort," and ended with, "Special operations might not be the right fit." What none of them noticed was the figure standing in the shadows beyond the obstacle course, motionless, observing, processing. Major Victoria Callahan had arrived at Fort Bragg 30 minutes earlier, timing her entrance to catch the morning training cycle in its rawest form. She wore her ACU with the unconscious precision of someone for whom the uniform was a second skin, pressed sharp enough to cut despite the 2-hour drive from her temporary quarters. The Sig Sauer P226 holstered at her thigh wasn't standard issue for field-grade officers in her position, but Victoria had never been standard issue for anything. She watched Thorpe and Briggs supervise the candidate's departure with professional efficiency. No malice in their movements, no obvious cruelty. That was the insidious nature of it. Bias that had calcified into doctrine, prejudice that had disguised itself as standards. Victoria had seen this performance before. Different actors, same script. Kandahar, when she'd been 22 and foolish enough to believe competence would speak louder than gender. Fallujah, where she'd learned that some men would rather die than take direction from a woman. Afghanistan, where betrayal wore the uniform of brotherhood. She committed every detail to memory with the practiced efficiency of an intelligence analyst. The way Thorpe's body language shifted from evaluation to dismissal. The casual cruelty of his commentary, The automatic complicity in Briggs's response. This wasn't assessment. This was elimination disguised as evaluation. The briefing room in Fort Bragg's command building maintained the institutional aesthetic of military facilities worldwide. Government-issue furniture arranged with geometric precision, walls decorated with unit insignia and operational maps, air heavy with coffee, and the particular tension that preceded new command assignments. Major General Bradford Stone stood at the head of the conference table, his 60 years wearing well on a frame maintained by daily PT and iron discipline that hadn't softened with rank. His hair had gone silver during Desert Storm, his face carved into permanent severity by decisions that sent men toward glory or graves. 5 men occupied the seats around the table, the senior training cadre for the Ranger Assessment and Selection Program. Thorpe sat at informal position of authority, his posture military perfect, but his eyes carrying wariness of a man who'd been summoned to too many meetings with brass, who didn't understand field realities. Stone checked his watch. "Gentlemen, we have a visitor from the Pentagon this morning." The pronoun landed like incoming artillery. "The Department of Defense has initiated a comprehensive review of Special Operations Selection Programs," Stone continued. "This review focuses specifically on gender integration protocols and evaluation consistency." Thorpe leaned forward. "Sir, if I may, our standards are gender neutral. We evaluate physical capability against mission requirements without—" The door opened. Victoria Callahan entered with economical movement of someone trained to conserve energy and minimize target profile. The men rose automatically, military courtesy overriding personal reservations. "Gentlemen," Stone said, "meet your new oversight officer, Major Victoria Callahan." "Major Callahan's service record is partially classified," Stone continued. "What I can tell you is that she's participated in operations in Kandahar, Fallujah, and Afghanistan. The Pentagon has assigned her to evaluate our Ranger Assessment Program." Thorpe's face remained professionally blank. "With respect, sir, classified usually means support roles rather than direct combat operations. We're training soldiers for battlefield conditions that don't make allowances for administrative experience." Victoria spoke for the first time. "Sergeant Thorpe, I'm familiar with battlefield conditions. I'm also familiar with evaluation bias disguised as standards enforcement. The Pentagon sent me here to determine which of those phenomena is occurring in your program." She set her folder on the table. "My observation period begins immediately. I'll be evaluating candidate proficiency with the M4A1 carbine and ACOG system, close quarters battle techniques, and survival skills in hostile terrain." She paused. "Last time I checked, bullets don't discriminate based on the gender of the shooter." Thorpe leaned back, reassessing. "Major, perhaps you could help us understand your relevant experience. Did it involve direct combat operations or support roles?" Victoria recognized the challenge. "Sergeant Thorpe, I qualified expert marksman on my first day at the range. Did you?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Something flickered across Thorpe's face. Surprise or recognition that he'd underestimated his opponent. "I qualified sharpshooter, ma'am. Advanced to expert within 6 months." Morning at the shooting range carried the peculiar stillness that preceded controlled violence. Victoria arrived precisely 15 minutes early, her inspection kit under one arm. Thorpe and Briggs arrived with military punctuality, followed by 6 Ranger candidates and 3 additional instructors. Victoria addressed the group. "Today's evaluation will cover standard M4A1 qualification with the ACOG system, followed by transition to sidearms under stress conditions." Thorpe stepped forward. "The candidates are prepared for standard qualification, Major, though we typically run more advanced drills at this stage. We'll begin with fundamentals, Sergeant. Mastery is built on basics, repeatedly executed under pressure." The assessment began with mechanical efficiency. Each candidate cycled through positions, shots forming tight groupings on targets. Victoria moved behind them, observing technique rather than just results. "Candidate Hawkins," Victoria called to a lean young man whose shots had been consistently centered. "Your grouping is excellent, but you're rushing your final shot in each sequence. Control your breathing through the entire magazine." Ethan Hawkins nodded, accepting the correction. Thorpe moved closer. "Hawkins is our top shooter, Major. His qualification scores have been perfect across all evaluations." "Perfect scores can mask developing bad habits, Sergeant," Victoria replied. "Habits that become fatal when conditions deteriorate." She demonstrated the proper breathing technique, then stepped back. Hawkins adjusted, applied the correction, and fired his next sequence. The grouping tightened even further. After all candidates completed their rotations, Victoria addressed them again. "Your technical proficiency is apparent. Now let's discuss the theory behind what you're doing." She pointed to the 400-meter target. "At this distance, with a 5.56-millimeter round, what factors most affect accuracy?" Silence greeted her question. "Wind drift," Victoria continued. "Bullet drop due to gravity, temperature and humidity if extreme enough, your breathing and heartbeat, the stability of your firing platform. You're not just shooters, you're ballistic engineers applying physics in real time." She lifted an M4 from the rack, checked it with practiced movements that spoke of thousands of repetitions. Without further commentary, Victoria assumed the standing position, sighted down the ACOG, controlled her breathing with the discipline of someone who'd done this under actual fire. The first shot broke clean. Center mass at 400 meters. She fired 4 more rounds in measured sequence. Each struck within the center ring, forming a group tight enough that individual holes nearly merged. Transition to kneeling. Same performance. Transition to prone. Final demonstration. When she rose and returned the weapon to its rack, the silence on the range had transformed from skepticism to something approaching respect. "Ballistics doesn't discriminate based on gender," Victoria said. "It only cares about physics and discipline." Thorpe's expression remained carefully neutral, but the slight tension in his jaw betrayed his thoughts. He hadn't expected this level of proficiency. The assumption had just been destroyed with 15 rounds at 400 meters. Victoria's quarters were Spartan: single bed, desk, small bathroom, window overlooking the eastern perimeter. She unpacked with efficiency, arranging a weathered compass, dog-eared copy of Sun Tzu, and small metal case containing service ribbons she never displayed. A knock interrupted her. Lieutenant Claire Ashford stood in the hallway, posture, textbook, perfect. 32 years old, blonde hair and regulation bun, careful maintenance that spoke of understanding that female officers faced additional scrutiny. "Major Callahan, I've been assigned as your liaison officer during your evaluation period." Victoria gestured for her to enter. "At ease, Lieutenant. How long have you been stationed here?" 4 years, ma'am. I'm one of 3 female training officers in the program." "And the reception?" Ashford's hesitation was brief but telling. "Professional, mostly. There are always exceptions." "Thorpe and Briggs." Ashford's eyes widened. "You've already identified them." "It's what I was trained to do." Victoria sat on the edge of her bed. "Tell me what I need to know that won't appear in official reports." Ashford glanced toward the door, verifying it was closed. "Thorpe arrived from 3rd Ranger Battalion 2 years ago. Briggs followed 6 months later. They served together in Afghanistan. Since their arrival, the female candidate washout rate has increased 47%. Complaints? 3 formal complaints filed, all dismissed after review. Who conducted the reviews? Major Gerald Hammond, Thorpe's former commanding officer from Afghanistan. Victoria nodded, the pattern becoming clear. Not just bias, but systematic protection. Ashford leaned forward. "Ma'am, there's something else. I did my master's thesis on female involvement in special operations. There were stories about a female operator with Delta Force. The call sign was Ghost 6. The designation hit Victoria like distant artillery. She hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in years. "Lieutenant, where did you hear that name?" "Multiple sources, ma'am, including Colonel Frank Dalton. He was Delta Force commander during that era." Victoria stood, moved to the window. "History is often more rumor than fact, Lieutenant, especially in our line of work." After Ashford departed, Victoria sat on the edge of her bed and closed her eyes. Kandahar rose before her like a ghost. 2007, when she'd been 22 and newly operational with Delta Force. When Sergeant Wade Kramer had questioned every tactical decision she'd made, undermined her authority, created friction that endangered the mission. When the compound infiltration had gone sideways because Kramer had deliberately triggered an alert, compromising their position out of pure spite. When Taliban fighters had swarmed the building and three good men, Sergeant Maxwell, Corporal Rhodes, PFC Donovan, had died in the crossfire. When she'd extracted the wounded survivors, completed the mission objective solo, and brought everyone else home. When she'd reported Kramer's deliberate sabotage and watched the chain of command dismiss it as stress-induced confusion. When Kramer had been quietly reassigned rather than prosecuted, the incident buried under layers of classification. Victoria opened her eyes, forcing the memories back. Tomorrow would require focus. The sun descended toward the western edge of base when Victoria made her way to a nondescript building near the administrative sector. Unlike other structures, this one bore only a number and a keypad entry system. She entered a code that few at Fort Bragg would possess. Inside, Colonel Frank Dalton looked up from his desk. At 65, his face testified to a life lived in harsh conditions, weathered by desert suns and mountain winds, lined by decisions that had sent men toward glory or graves. His hair had gone silver during Cold War operations in Berlin, but his eyes remained sharp blue. "They told me Ghost 6 was coming," he said, rising carefully. "Didn't quite believe it until now." Victoria closed the door. "Hello, Frank." He gestured to a chair. "So they finally made it official. Women in combat roles. Only took them 30 years to acknowledge what we already knew in the field." "Progress moves at its own pace," Victoria replied, "especially in institutions built on tradition." Dalton's laugh was dry as Afghan dust. "Tradition? That's a diplomatic way of saying stubborn old men." He studied her face. "Kandahar 2007, Afghanistan 2014. The three-day hold in Helmand province when extraction got delayed and you kept two wounded operators alive in Taliban territory. None of that exists on paper, does it?" "Those operations don't exist anywhere," Victoria said carefully. "Neither did my role in them." Dalton nodded. "Why are you really here? This Ranger assessment review could be handled by any competent officer." Victoria leaned forward. "Because the integration program is failing in specific areas, and they need to understand why. Women are qualifying but not being selected. Official reasons are vague. The unofficial reasons are more direct. Institutional resistance at the instructor level," Dalton said. "Evaluation bias. Deliberate washouts. You know Thorpe." "I know the type." Dalton's expression darkened. "Thorpe isn't just skeptical, Victoria. He's dangerous. His personnel file shows 37 female candidates washed out under his supervision in the last 2 years." Victoria absorbed this. "He's protecting his territory. He believes he's protecting the integrity of the force." Dalton leaned forward. "Be careful around him. Men like that don't change their minds easily, and they don't fight fair when they're cornered." Victoria met his gaze. "Neither do I." Dalton's weathered face creased into a slight smile. "No, you never did." He rose, moved to a small cabinet where he extracted 2 glasses and a bottle of bourbon. "This isn't an official meeting, so I think we can bend regulations slightly." He poured 2 fingers in each glass, handed one to Victoria. "To ghosts," he said, raising his glass. "To memories," Victoria replied, touching her glass to his. "One last thing," Dalton said. "Whatever happens here, whatever you uncover, watch your back. Thorpe has friends at the Pentagon, men who share his views on combat integration. Victoria nodded. The battlefield before her wasn't just Fort Bragg's training grounds. It was invisible terrain of military politics and institutional resistance. The next morning brought tactical training drills. Morrison had arranged obstacle course with professional precision, barricade firing positions, cover-to-cover movement lanes, target discrimination scenarios. Victoria announced she would run the course alongside candidates. Thorpe's expression flickered with surprise. The course is designed for candidates under evaluation, Major. Consider me temporarily under evaluation then, Sergeant, Victoria replied, checking her training Glock. I prefer hands-on assessment. The drill began with methodical intensity. Candidates moved through the course, engaging targets, transitioning between weapons, navigating obstacles while maintaining tactical awareness. Victoria followed the same sequence, her movements precise and economical. Thorpe watched with growing confusion. Her performance contradicted his expectations. Each movement, each weapon transition, each target engagement reflected muscle memory of someone who had executed these skills under actual fire. When Victoria completed the final station, Thorpe approached. Impressive performance, Major, he said, the words emerging as if extracted under duress. The course design is excellent, Victoria replied. Realistic pressure points, good scenario progression. She used the opening to probe. I'm particularly interested in your SEER component. I understand you'll be running that evaluation next week. Yes, ma'am. 72 hours in the Uwari Mountains, limited equipment, evasion scenarios, resistance training. I'd like to review the full protocol before then. Something hardened in Thorpe's expression. Of course, though the scenarios change for each cohort to prevent preparation advantages. Their attention was diverted by commotion at one of the drill stations. Candidate Hawkins was engaged in heated discussion with Sergeant Briggs. As they approached, Briggs's voice became audible. Not here to debate tactics, candidate. You follow the protocol as established. Hawkins stood his ground. With respect, Sergeant, the protocol creates unnecessary exposure during the room transition. The manual is a guideline, not gospel, Briggs snapped. Victoria assessed the training station, a room-clearing scenario with multiple entry points. Hawkins had identified a mandatory exposure point during transition that violated basic CQB principles. What's the situation here? Thorpe asked. Before Briggs could answer, Victoria spoke. Candidate Hawkins has identified a legitimate safety concern with the station layout. She turned to Hawkins. Explain your observation. Hawkins straightened. The protocol requires transitioning between rooms through this central point, sir. It creates a fatal funnel with no cover options and exposure to two potential threat areas simultaneously. Thorpe frowned, examining the layout. Victoria could see the moment he recognized the flaw. Standard procedure would maintain wall contact and clear sequentially, Hawkins continued, rather than crossing the open space as the current protocol requires. Briggs's jaw tightened. The point of the exercise is to test decision-making under imperfect conditions. The point, Victoria countered, is to instill proper tactical habits that translate to survival in actual combat. She turned to Thorpe. Your assessment, Sergeant? Thorpe was trapped between defending his colleague and acknowledging a legitimate safety concern. The candidate's observation has merit, he said finally. We'll adjust the protocol for the remaining rotations. Victoria nodded. Good tactical awareness, candidate. Operational safety supersedes hierarchy when lives are at stake. She turned to Thorpe and Briggs. That principle applies at all levels of command, gentlemen. The message was clear. She had identified the first crack in their system and exploited it to establish her authority. That evening, Victoria received an unexpected visitor. Candidate Hawkins stood in her hallway, his expression mixing determination and uncertainty. May I speak with you, Major? Privately? Victoria studied him, then stepped aside. This is irregular, Candidate Hawkins. I know, ma'am, but I believe you should know something about the upcoming SEER evaluation. Victoria remained silent, waiting. Hawkins took a deep breath. I overheard Sergeants Thorpe and Briggs discussing modifications to the evaluation parameters, specifically for your observation group. They mentioned ensuring that certain candidates would face enhanced challenges. You're making serious allegations against superior officers, Hawkins. Yes, ma'am, I am. His eyes met hers directly. Because I joined the Army to serve honorably. What they're planning violates that principle. Victoria considered the young man before her. Coming forward carried significant risk to his career. Why tell me this? Why not report through standard channels? With respect, ma'am, I think you know why. Standard channels haven't been particularly responsive to certain types of complaints. Victoria nodded. Thank you for bringing this to my attention, candidate. I'll handle it appropriately. After Hawkins left, Victoria opened her laptop and began typing a detailed report, encrypted for transmission to her actual commanding officer, a deputy director at the Pentagon whose interest in the integration program went beyond public relations. The last line was most significant. Confirms suspicion of deliberate assessment manipulation targeting specific candidate profiles. We'll proceed with Phase 2 of evaluation to gather conclusive evidence. She encrypted the file, sent it through secure channels, then deleted all traces from her local drive. Tomorrow would require a different approach. Thorpe had revealed his professional competence today, but also his vulnerabilities, and Victoria was about to exploit both. The forest canopy filtered morning light into fragments, transforming the Uwari Mountains into a cathedral of shadow and green. Victoria moved through undergrowth with economy of motion that came from 2 decades of field operations, her boots finding purchase on terrain that would betray less experienced operators. 3 hours into the SEER exercise, the mountains had already begun their work of separation, dividing those who understood wilderness navigation from those who merely thought they did. Victoria read the forest like text. Moss patterns indicated north. Broken twigs at 4-foot height marked human passage. The wind carried information about weather systems building beyond the ridgeline. She paused at a natural overlook, using binoculars to scan the valley below. Movement caught her attention. 3 figures maintaining proper tactical spacing. Candidate Hawkins led the element, his navigation steady despite modified coordinates Thorpe had programmed into their GPS units. Behind them, maintaining parallel course, Sergeant Briggs ghosted through trees. His position told Victoria everything. He wasn't evaluating, he was herding. Victoria tracked Briggs's movement, projecting his trajectory. He was directing Hawkins's team away from the efficient route toward a section marked by steep slopes and stream crossing. In normal conditions, this would simply be more challenging. But with the storm building beyond western peaks, that stream crossing would transform from challenge to genuine hazard. Victoria checked her GPS. One of the micro-trackers she'd planted 3 days earlier was active, confirming location of the diversion Thorpe's network had prepared. She photographed Briggs's position with button camera, adding another piece to her evidence chain. Then she moved, circling wide to intercept Hawkins's team before they reached the trap. A sound reached her before visual contact. Faint click of radio transmission. Victoria froze, controlling her breathing, scanning for the source. 30 meters to her right, partially concealed behind a fallen oak, Staff Sergeant Travis Jennings crouched with tactical radio and binoculars. His position and equipment didn't match standard opposition force protocols. Victoria approached from his blind side, using terrain masking and his focus to close distance undetected. She settled into observation position 15 meters away, close enough to hear clearly. Group Alpha approaching Waypoint Delta, Jennings said into his radio. ETA 15 minutes. The response came through clearly. Roger that. Diversion is active. Maintain observation position. Do not intervene if complications arise. Victoria's jaw tightened. Complications was operational code for injury or death. Jennings had just been explicitly ordered not to assist if candidates encountered danger. She photographed his position and radio setup, then withdrew silently. The evidence chain was building. Modified coordinates, unauthorized observation posts, explicit orders to withhold assistance. This had escalated beyond bias into conspiracy. Victoria increased her pace, moving to intercept Hawkins's team before they reached the stream. She emerged onto the trail 200 meters before the waypoint. The three candidates reacted with trained precision. Hawkins's hand moved toward his training weapon before recognition registered. "Major Callahan," Hawkins said carefully. "At ease, candidate." Victoria's voice carried authority. "Taking a direct interest in your navigation progress." Rebecca Sullivan, the second candidate, stepped forward. 26 years old, Georgetown graduate, already showing situational awareness that marked natural operators. Behind them, Sergeant Briggs materialized from the forest. His expression darkened when he spotted Victoria. "Major," he said, tone suggesting she'd violated protocols. "This is an independent evaluation phase. Candidate interaction with supervisory staff is restricted to designated checkpoints." Victoria turned to face him. "I'm not supervisory staff, Sergeant. I'm conducting course evaluation, which requires direct observation of candidate performance under various conditions." She shifted attention to Hawkins. "Your next checkpoint approach crosses that stream ahead. What's your assessment of current conditions versus forecast weather?" Hawkins glanced at his map, then at the sky where clouds were building with ominous determination. "GPS coordinates indicate we continue along this bearing for approximately half a kilometer, cross at the marked ford, then proceed northwest to checkpoint Alpha." "And the weather analysis?" Victoria pressed. The third candidate, Marcus Flynn, spoke up. 25 years old, prior enlisted infantry. "Cloud formation suggests storm system moving faster than briefed, ma'am. But we should reach the crossing before conditions deteriorate." Victoria pulled out her map. "Stream feeding from higher elevations. Current flow rate approximately 50 cubic feet per second. Storm forecast indicates 2 inches of rainfall in next 3 hours. Flash flood potential?" Understanding dawned on Hawkins's face. "Significant, ma'am. Flow rate could increase to 500 cubic feet per second or more. The crossing would become impassable, potentially deadly." "Your recommendation?" Briggs stepped forward. "With respect, Major, assessment of environmental conditions is part of the evaluation. Candidates need to make their own risk calculations." "Of course, Sergeant," Victoria agreed. "I'm simply providing environmental intelligence that would be available to an operational team. Proper risk assessment requires complete information." She turned to the candidates. "Standard protocol when facing potential flash flood conditions?" Hawkins studied his map. "Identify alternate crossing points or delay water crossing until conditions stabilize, ma'am." His finger traced a route. "There's another crossing half a kilometer downstream. Longer route but lower elevation, wider stream bed, reduced flash flood risk." "Sound analysis," Victoria said. "Your call, candidate." Hawkins looked to his teammates, received confirming nods. "We're adjusting course to the alternate crossing, ma'am." Briggs's jaw tightened, but he was trapped. To insist on the original route would contradict the adaptive decision-making principles Special Operations Selection was designed to identify. "Carry on," Victoria said. As the team moved off, Briggs lingered. His expression had shifted to something colder, recognition that Victoria had countered a prepared trap. "Interesting timing," he said quietly. "Your appearance at exactly the right moment." Victoria met his gaze with absolute calm. "Good intelligence often appears exactly when needed, Sergeant. That's a lesson from field operations." The unspoken message hung between them. She knew about the trap, had evidence of the conspiracy, and had tactical acumen to counter it. Briggs said nothing more, but the look in his eyes promised escalation. The sky had transformed in 2 hours. What had been distant clouds had become rolling front of thunderheads that devoured blue sky. Temperature had dropped 12 degrees, wind shifting from breeze to sustained force that bent smaller trees. Victoria had positioned herself on a ridge overlooking Checkpoint Echo. Through monoculars, she watched four instructors under hastily erected tarp, their body language conveying growing concern. Several candidate groups had reached the checkpoint and been directed toward the emergency assembly point. The exercise was winding down as weather exceeded safe parameters. But Hawkins's team hadn't appeared. Victoria checked her GPS tracker. Their last position placed them at the alternate crossing, moving toward checkpoint. They should have arrived 20 minutes ago. Her tactical radio crackled. Victoria keyed her encryption module. Sierra Actual, this is range control. Weather advisory upgraded to severe thunderstorm warning. Lightning strikes reported throughout area. Recommend immediate suspension of field operations. Stone's voice came back with command authority. All stations, this is Sierra Actual. Exercise is suspended, effective immediately. All personnel withdraw to designated emergency assembly points. Acknowledge by element. Victoria listened as each checkpoint acknowledged. Then Briggs's transmission came through with suspicious clarity. Echo 7, already moving to assembly point. Lost comms with assigned candidate group approximately 30 minutes ago. Attempted reconnection, but storm interference prevented re-establishment. Victoria's hand tightened on the radio. Briggs had just reported abandoning Hawkins's team in deteriorating conditions. She waited for Thorpe's transmission. It came 40 seconds later. Sierra Actual, this is training lead. All personnel accounted for and moving to assembly points. Exercise equipment secured. Estimate all elements at assembly points within 90 minutes. Victoria's breath caught. All personnel accounted for. It was a lie, a direct, documented false report. 3 candidates were still in the field, and Thorpe had just told command they were safe. The implications went beyond training complications into criminal negligence. Victoria keyed her radio, bypassing exercise frequencies to access command channel directly. Sierra Actual, this is November 6. Recommend suspension confirmed. But be advised I am tracking candidate team that has not yet reached checkpoint. Will report when located. Stone's response came immediately. November 6, acknowledge suspension order. What is status of missing team? Approximately 2 kilometers southwest of Checkpoint Echo. Last known position, alternate stream crossing. Have not established direct contact, but am tracking their probable route. Pause. Then Stone's voice carried new edge. November 6, command has ordered all personnel to emergency assembly points. Weather service indicates conditions will continue to deteriorate. Understood, sir. 3 candidates are unaccounted for in life-threatening conditions. That supersedes standard evacuation protocols. I'm going after them. Another pause. Copy that, November 6. Proceed at your discretion. We have helicopter assets on standby if extraction becomes necessary. Keep this channel open. Wilco, Sierra Actual, November 6, out. Victoria secured her radio and began moving downslope. The rain arrived as she cleared the ridgeline. Not gradual increase, but immediate deluge. Sheets of water driven horizontal by wind. Visibility collapsed to less than 10 meters. The forest floor transformed beneath her boots. Solid ground becoming network of streams. Thunder rolled across mountains with percussion that shook the air. Victoria navigated by compass and terrain memory, using GPS only for confirmation. The skills that mattered now weren't technological. They were fundamental abilities that had kept soldiers alive for centuries. Read terrain, maintain heading, adapt to conditions, survive. The stream ahead registered as sound before sight, a roar that cut through wind and rain. Victoria pushed through final vegetation screen and stopped. The stream had become a torrent. What had measured 15 feet wide now spread across 40 feet, carrying debris from broken branches to full trees. The water moved with deadly force, churning muddy brown. No candidate team could cross here, which meant Hawkins's group was either trapped on the far side or had found alternate route. Victoria followed the stream edge upstream, reasoning that if Hawkins had demonstrated good judgment earlier, he'd continue seeking higher ground when conditions deteriorated. The going was treacherous. Mud sucked at her boots. Fallen branches concealed holes and obstacles. Twice she diverted around sections where rising water made passage impossible. Then she heard it, a sound that cut through storm chaos. A voice raised in command cadence, followed by responses suggesting coordinated activity. Victoria altered course. 30 meters later, she found them. Natural shelter formed by massive granite boulders provided minimal protection from the storm's fury. 3 candidates had jury-rigged additional cover using ponchos and pine branches. Hawkins emerged as Victoria approached, his hand moving toward training weapon before recognition and relief flooded his face. "Major Callahan." "At ease, candidate." Victoria moved into the shelter's protection, assessing with rapid scan. Sullivan was applying field dressing to Flynn's leg, where torn pants revealed laceration approximately 6 inches long. "Situation report," Victoria said, crouching to examine Flynn's wound. Hawkins delivered the brief with admirable concision. "Stream was already flooding when we arrived at alternate crossing point, ma'am. We attempted to locate another crossing upstream, but conditions deteriorated too rapidly. During withdrawal to higher ground, candidate Flynn was struck by falling branch. We established this shelter and attempted radio contact, but all frequencies are compromised by storm interference." Victoria nodded. "Exercise has been suspended. All personnel ordered to emergency assembly points. Nearest is Echo, the ranger station approximately 3 kilometers southeast." Flynn's face showed controlled pain. "Ma'am, with respect, I can move. We should attempt to reach the assembly point." Victoria examined the wound more closely. The cut was deep, missing major blood vessels by margins that spoke to luck. Field treatment was appropriate for immediate care, but the injury would severely hamper movement. "Negative," Victoria said firmly. "Night movement through unfamiliar terrain in severe weather with an injured team member creates unacceptable risk levels. We establish overnight position here, improve shelter, maintain medical monitoring. We'll attempt evacuation at first light or when storm abates." She caught doubt in Hawkins's expression, natural concern of a soldier who believed movement toward friendly resources was correct protocol. "This isn't a test anymore, candidate," Victoria said, her voice carrying weight of experience. "This is real-world survival application. Sometimes the tactically sound decision is to hold position when movement would create more casualties." Understanding registered in Hawkins's eyes. "We'll need to improve the shelter," Hawkins said, shifting to implementation mode. "Agreed," Victoria said, removing her pack. "We have approximately 90 minutes of usable daylight remaining. Priority tasks, shelter improvement, water management, continued injury care, and communication attempts." She extracted medical supplies from her pack, advanced kit beyond standard issue. Quick clot hemostatic agent, waterproof trauma dressings, Israeli bandages designed for combat wounds. "Sullivan, Hawkins," Victoria directed, "gather materials to reinforce shelter. Flynn, I'm upgrading your dressing. How's your pain level?" 3 out of 10, ma'am," Flynn managed with tight smile. "I've had worse playing high school football." Victoria appreciated the humor, another indicator that morale remained intact. She removed Sullivan's field dressing carefully, cleaned the wound with antiseptic, applied quick clot to control bleeding, then covered everything with waterproof trauma dressing. "That should hold," she said. "Monitor for increased pain, numbness, or signs bleeding is resuming." Hawkins and Sullivan returned with materials, immediately setting to work. Within 40 minutes, they'd constructed lean-to structure that would provide critical protection through the night. Temperature continued dropping as darkness settled. Victoria distributed emergency ration bars, not for taste, but for calories and psychological comfort from shared sustenance. She activated single chemical light stick, its green glow providing illumination without compromising night vision. "Will they search for us tonight?" Sullivan asked. Victoria answered honestly, "No. Night search in these conditions would endanger more personnel without significantly improving our chances. Command will establish search patterns at first light, assuming storm has diminished." Hawkins studied her face. "You've been in situations like this before, ma'am. Afghanistan, 2014. Extraction delayed by 3 days. Mountain terrain, hostile forces in area, 2 wounded team members. We held position, maintained discipline, and everyone came home." "What was the key to survival?" Flynn asked. Victoria considered the question, memories of Helmand Province rising. Captain Garrett with shattered femur, Sergeant Wallace with sucking chest wound. Taliban patrols passing within 50 meters of their hide site. "Patience," she said finally, "and understanding that sometimes the hardest tactical decision is to do nothing. Every instinct tells you to move, to act, to push towards safety. But movement in wrong conditions guarantees casualties. Patience preserves combat power." The answer satisfied them. Conversation lulled, replaced by constant percussion of rain and deep rumble of thunder. Despite noise, fatigue soon claimed the candidates. Victoria maintained watch, monitoring Flynn's condition and scanning their surroundings. The emergency transponder Dalton had provided sat beside her, its indicator light blinking steadily. Near midnight, new sound penetrated the storm's roar. Distant but unmistakable, the distinctive thrum of helicopter rotors. Victoria moved to the shelter entrance, straining to locate the aircraft through darkness and rain. No visual contact was possible, but the sound pattern was clear. A Black Hawk flying search grid, its pilot taking significant risk. She extracted signal flare from her vest, not standard issue, but part of personal kit she never entered field without. Military-grade magnesium compound, designed to cut through darkness and weather. The rotor sound grew louder, then diminished, then returned, the helicopter sweeping area in expanding patterns. On third pass, the sound peaked directly overhead. Victoria stepped into the open, aimed the flare at 45-degree angle, and fired. The magnesium ignited with blinding intensity, turning night into day and rain into silver curtains. For 3 critical seconds, their position was illuminated with unmistakable clarity. The helicopter's reaction was immediate, engine pitch change as it banked sharply toward them. Moments later, powerful spotlight cut through rain, sweeping until it locked on their shelter. Behind her, Hawkins emerged. "Extraction, ma'am?" "Extraction," Victoria confirmed. The Black Hawk couldn't land, but it didn't need to. A figure rappelled from hovering aircraft, descent controlled despite treacherous conditions. Colonel Frank Dalton, in full weather gear and tactical harness, disconnected from rappel line and moved toward her. "Thought you could use a hand," he shouted above rotor noise, weathered face splitting into brief grin. Victoria felt surge of gratitude. "How'd you find us?" Dalton tapped his chest where transponder receiver would be. "Cold War tech. Works when nothing else does. Got your signal about an hour ago." He glanced toward shelter. "One injured?" "Leg laceration, stable but mobility impaired." Dalton nodded. "Bird can take 2 at a time. Injured first with medical escort, then the others. We've got maybe 20-minute window before weather closes in again." The extraction proceeded with practiced precision. Flynn was secured in rescue basket, Sullivan accompanying him. The Black Hawk lifted both toward safety. 20 minutes later, the aircraft returned. Hawkins and Victoria secured themselves to extraction lines, while Dalton remained on ground to coordinate with search teams. As the line pulled taut, Dalton gripped Victoria's arm. "Thorpe reported all personnel accounted for at 17:05. Never mentioned missing candidates. Every transmission is logged, every lie documented." Victoria absorbed the information, Final piece of evidence clicking into place. Thorpe had falsified safety reports during active emergency, abandoning personnel in life-threatening situation. In combat zones, such actions constituted criminal negligence. Documented? She asked. Dalton nodded. Every transmission, every check-in, every discrepancy, it's all in operational log, backed up to servers Thorpe can't access. The line began lifting Victoria toward aircraft. She locked eyes with Dalton one final time, seeing the same cold determination she felt. Thorpe had crossed from institutional resistance to active endangerment. Whatever his motivations, he'd violated the most fundamental tenet of military leadership: responsibility for those under his command. The Black Hawk climbed through storm, wind buffeting Victoria's ascending form. Inside cabin, crew chief helped her disconnect and guided her to seat beside Hawkins. Through window, Victoria watched storm continue to rage across mountains that had nearly claimed 4 lives. The forest below was invisible, swallowed by darkness and weather. Above it, the Black Hawk banked toward Fort Bragg's distant lights, carrying survivors whose rescue had just provided evidence for prosecution that would reach beyond one sergeant's career. In cockpit, pilot's voice came through Victoria's headset. November 6, this is Rescue 1. All passengers secured. Estimate Fort Bragg in 20 minutes. Good copy, Rescue 1, Victoria replied. Thanks for the pickup. Victoria leaned back against vibrating cabin wall, allowing exhaustion to seep into muscles. But her mind remained active, processing next phase. The storm would pass. Morning would bring official inquiries, incident reports, command review of decision chains. And in those reviews, Sergeant Declan Thorpe's defense would collapse under weight of his own actions. The reckoning was coming. Beside her, Hawkins had succumbed to exhaustion. Sullivan monitored Flynn with continued vigilance. These candidates had performed exactly as selection was designed to identify: maintaining discipline, making sound decisions, supporting teammates. They'd earned their place in any elite unit, and Victoria would ensure Thorpe's bias would never again prevent qualified candidates from receiving recognition their capabilities had earned. The Black Hawk descended through storm toward Fort Bragg's lights, carrying evidence that would change careers, end conspiracies, and force institutional reckoning. Ghost 6 was done operating in shadows. Tomorrow, the Ghost became prosecutor. Morning light filtered through half-drawn blinds of Fort Bragg's medical wing, casting geometric patterns across polished floors. Victoria stood in the doorway of the recovery ward, observing the 3 candidates with clinical assessment. Marcus Flynn occupied the bed nearest the window, his injured leg properly dressed and elevated. 23 stitches, deep tissue trauma, but no permanent damage. Full recovery projected within 6 weeks. Rebecca Sullivan slept soundly 2 beds down. Mild hypothermia treated with warming protocols. Released to quarters by evening if vitals remain stable. Ethan Hawkins had been treated and released 3 hours earlier. Minor lacerations, cleared for light duty. They'd all survived. Against conditions that could easily have killed them, they'd maintained discipline and made decisions that preserved their lives. Behind her, footsteps approached. Major General Bradford Stone appeared, his silver hair catching morning light, face showing weariness from managing crisis aftermath. Major Callahan, he said quietly, your after-action report mentions several irregularities. Victoria turned to face him. That's one word for it, sir. I've submitted full briefing to your office in Pentagon oversight. Stone studied her face. Walk with me, Major. They moved down corridor in silence, through security doors to administrative section. Stone led her to small conference room, secured the door. He placed a thick folder on table. I've received preliminary report from Colonel Dalton, along with complete communications log from yesterday's operation. He opened the folder. Sergeant Thorpe radioed confirmation that all personnel were accounted for at 17:05 hours. At that time, 3 candidates and yourself were still in the field in life-threatening conditions. Correct, sir. He falsified a safety report during active military operations with severe weather warnings in effect. Yes, sir. Stone's jaw tightened. This goes beyond training protocol violations, Major. This borders on criminal negligence. It crossed that border when he deliberately directed candidates into hazardous conditions, then abandoned them when situation deteriorated, Victoria said. It wasn't poor judgment, sir. It was deliberate endangerment. Stone studied her. You came here to evaluate our integration program. Instead, you've uncovered systematic sabotage. He leaned forward. What I need to know, Major, is how deep this goes. Is Thorpe an isolated problem or symptomatic of broader resistance? Victoria chose words carefully. Thorpe has allies at multiple levels, sir. Personnel files indicate patterns of female candidates being washed out under questionable circumstances. Performance evaluations modified after submission. Complaint investigations conducted by officers with direct connections to subjects of those complaints. You're describing a network, not an individual. I'm describing a culture, sir, one that exists within our broader military culture, but contradicts our stated values. Stone absorbed this. Your recommendation? Complete transparency, Victoria replied without hesitation. Full investigation with external oversight. Public consequences for verified violations. Not reassignments, not quiet retirements, actual accountability. That approach could damage programs we've spent decades building. With respect, General, those programs are already damaged. The question is whether we repair the foundation or just repaint the exterior. Something flickered across Stone's expression. Respect or recognition of argument he'd heard before. You've prepared for this conversation. I've had versions of it throughout my career, sir. The outcomes have typically been cosmetic changes, reassignments rather than accountability. Victoria held his gaze. And that's why we're still having this conversation in 2025. Stone nodded slowly. The JAG representatives arrive in 2 hours. They're assembling for an Article 32 inquiry. He closed the folder. This is your operation now, Major. What's your play? Victoria stood. Complete evidence presentation. Recorded testimony from all involved personnel. Recommendation for courts-martial where appropriate. And, sir, no negotiated outcomes that protect people who endanger their own troops. The Fort Bragg Conference Center had been transformed into quasi-judicial setting, long tables in U formation, recording equipment positioned to capture testimony, wall-mounted screens displaying maps and communication logs. Victoria sat at one end, flanked by 2 JAG officers. Colonel Vincent Aldridge possessed stern demeanor of someone who'd spent 30 years prosecuting military justice cases. Major Catherine Hayes maintained alert professionalism that marked rising stars. Across from them, Stone occupied central position. The room had filled gradually. Senior officers from base departments, medical personnel, Pentagon representatives who'd traveled overnight. Colonel Dalton sat near the back, his posture relaxed, but eyes alert. The doors opened, admitting Master Sergeant Declan Thorpe and Sergeant First Class Owen Briggs. Both wore freshly pressed uniforms with full complement of ribbons, visual reminders of years of service. Thorpe's bearing remained military perfect. Briggs appeared less composed, his gaze flickering around the room. Stone called room to order. This proceeding will come to order. Master Sergeant Thorpe, Sergeant First Class Briggs, you are appearing before an Article 32 preliminary hearing to determine whether charges should be referred for court-martial. He paused. You are not required to make any statements, and any statements you do make may be used in subsequent trial by court-martial. Do you understand these rights? Both confirmed understanding. Stone gestured toward JAG officers. Colonel Aldridge will present preliminary findings. Major Callahan will provide testimony regarding her direct observations. Aldridge stood, moving to central display with confidence of someone accustomed to high-stakes arguments. He activated screen, revealing timeline from pre-dawn assembly to helicopter extraction. This inquiry concerns events during SEER evaluation exercise in Uwari Mountain Training Area, he said. Specifically, we are investigating alleged violations of Articles 92, 107, and 134 of Uniform Code of Military Justice, failure to obey lawful orders, false official statements, and conduct endangering welfare of others. Room's attention focused with intensity. Aldridge displayed meteorological data. Weather forecasts indicated severe storm system with high probability of dangerous conditions. This information was available 36 hours prior to exercise. Next slide showed communication logs. At 15:32 hours, Sergeant Thorpe acknowledged severe weather advisory. At 16:20, Sergeant Briggs reported losing contact with assigned candidate team. At 16:47, General Stone issued suspension order due to weather exceeding safety parameters. Aldridge paused. At 17:05, Sergeant Thorpe transmitted the following. He pressed button. Audio recording filled room with Thorpe's voice. Sierra Actual, this is training lead. All personnel accounted for and moving to assembly points. Recording ended. Silence followed, heavy with implication. At the time of that transmission, Aldridge continued, 3 candidates and Major Callahan were still in field, in deteriorating conditions, with 1 candidate injured. This was known to Sergeant Briggs, who had reported losing contact 45 minutes earlier. Victoria watched Thorpe's face. His expression remained controlled, but she caught micro-expressions, slight tightening around eyes, fractional jaw shift. Aldridge displayed GPS tracking. This data confirms Sergeant Briggs separated from assigned team at 16:18 hours, well before weather reached dangerous levels. He arrived at assembly point at 17:02, 3 minutes before Sergeant Thorpe's false report. The colonel turned to Thorpe. Sergeant, standard protocol when losing contact requires immediate notification and initiation of location procedures. Why was this not followed? Thorpe stood. Sir, communication systems were compromised by atmospheric conditions. I made tactical decision that candidates would self-navigate to checkpoint, consistent with SEER parameters emphasizing individual problem solving. It was smooth response, technically plausible denial wrapped in operational justification. Aldridge wasn't impressed. Sergeant, GPS data shows you maintained functional communication with other field units until 17:20, 15 minutes after your report. How do you reconcile this discrepancy? Different frequencies, different equipment capabilities, sir. Field communications are notoriously unreliable in adverse weather. And the decision to report all personnel accounted when you knew 3 candidates were missing? Thorpe's hesitation was brief. I had reasonable expectation based on their last known position that they would reach assembly points within reported timeframe. Exercise suspension had been ordered, so I assumed they would follow standard protocols. Victoria felt cold assessment settle. Thorpe was good, deflecting with technical details, reframing abandonment as tactical confidence. But Aldridge had built foundation too carefully. He activated new display, photographic evidence from Victoria's button camera. Sergeant, can you explain why Staff Sergeant Jennings was positioned in unauthorized observation post with tactical radio, monitoring candidate movement but under orders not to intervene if complications arose? Genuine uncertainty flickered across Thorpe's face for the first time. And can you explain why GPS coordinates provided to teams were modified from approved course design without authorization? Evidence continued mounting. What had begun as technical defense was collapsing under weight of systematic documentation. Stone intervened. This hearing will recess for 30 minutes while panel reviews evidence. Sergeant Thorpe, Sergeant Briggs remain available in adjacent conference room. As the 2 sergeants were escorted out, Victoria caught Dalton's eye. The older officer's expression conveyed satisfaction, professional appreciation for operation executed with precision. The recess extended to an hour. Victoria remained in small office adjacent to conference center, reviewing notes. Dalton entered. Something's happening. Briggs requested separate meeting with JAG officers. Been in there 20 minutes. Victoria nodded. He's cutting a deal. Looks that way. Thorpe's been making calls. Pentagon connections, presumably. Expected, Victoria replied. Dalton's slight smile suggested he knew something others didn't. There's something Thorpe doesn't know yet. What's that? Full report was transmitted to Congressional Oversight Committee at 0600 this morning. Regardless of today's outcome, there will be public accountability. Victoria felt strategic satisfaction. She learned this lesson in Kandahar. When fighting institutional protection networks, establish facts in venues they couldn't influence before they knew to mobilize defenses. Lieutenant Ashford appeared. Major, they're reconvening. And there's been a development. Sergeant Briggs is testifying separately. The conference room had transformed subtly. Briggs now positioned at separate table with newly assigned legal counsel. Thorpe occupied original position, but his posture had hardened into something more defensive. Stone called proceedings back to order. This inquiry will now continue. Panel has reviewed evidence, and we have received request from Sergeant First Class Briggs to provide sworn testimony.
Colonel Aldridge?
Aldridge stood, his demeanor shifted slightly. Sergeant Briggs has agreed to provide comprehensive statement. In exchange for cooperation, Judge Advocate General has agreed to recommend charges be limited to Article 92 violations, dereliction of duty, rather than more serious Article 134 charges. Thorpe's jaw tightened visibly. His eyes shot toward Briggs with expression mixing betrayal and calculation. Briggs rose, raised his right hand for oath, began testimony. His voice initially wavered, but steadied. Master Sergeant Thorpe instructed me to implement modified training protocols for candidates he had identified as problematic. This included candidate Hawkins, who had questioned training methods, and female candidates Sullivan and others. We were directed to create conditions that would increase likelihood of their failure without appearing to directly target them. Words landed like artillery shells. Aldridge guided Briggs through specific questions, each response building comprehensive picture of systematic effort to undermine certain candidates. Most damning testimony came regarding storm events. When severe weather advisory came through, Sergeant Thorpe instructed field supervisors to maintain normal protocols rather than implementing standard safety measures. He specifically stated, Briggs paused, swallowed, continued, let them figure it out. That's what selection is for. If they can't handle adverse conditions, they don't belong in special operations. Victoria watched Thorpe. His face had become stone, but his right hand had closed into fist. Small but telling indication. Briggs continued. At 16:20, I reported to Sergeant Thorpe that I had lost contact with my assigned team and requested guidance. He instructed me to proceed to assembly point and report that communications were compromised by weather, but that candidates would self-navigate. Did you express concern? Aldridge asked. Yes, sir. I stated that weather was deteriorating rapidly and candidates might require assistance. Sergeant Thorpe responded that exercise suspension order meant candidates would automatically implement emergency protocols, and that our presence might interfere with their independent problem solving. What happened after you reached assembly point? At approximately 1700, Sergeant Thorpe contacted me and instructed me to confirm all assigned personnel had reached assembly points. When I informed him 3 candidates were still unaccounted for, he stated he would report all personnel accounted and that Major Callahan would locate missing candidates or they would self-extract by first light. Conference room had gone completely silent. When Briggs finished, Aldridge turned toward Thorpe. Master Sergeant, do you wish to make statement in response? Thorpe stood slowly. For several seconds he said nothing, and Victoria recognized the moment. Battlefield commander assessing changed tactical situation. Sergeant Briggs's characterization of events is incomplete and lacks proper operational context. Thorpe said finally. The modifications to training protocols were within my authority as senior instructor and were designed to realistically challenge candidates consistent with actual special operations requirements. He paused. If communication failures occurred during storm, they were a result of equipment limitations and environmental conditions, not deliberate negligence. The assessment that candidates would implement proper emergency protocols was based on their training and performance. Victoria noted careful phrasing, technical denial without directly contradicting documented evidence. Aldridge wasn't allowing escape. Sergeant, communication logs clearly show functional radio transmission with other field units well after you reported all personnel accounted. How do you reconcile this specific discrepancy? Different frequencies have different propagation characteristics in adverse weather, sir. And the explicit directive to Sergeant Briggs to report all personnel accounted when you knew 3 candidates were missing. Thorpe's hesitation was fractional. I had tactical confidence based on their demonstrated capabilities and last known position that they would reach safety within reported timeframe. Stone intervened. Sergeant Thorpe, tactical confidence doesn't override mandatory reporting requirements during suspended operations with severe weather warnings. Standard protocol requires immediate notification when personnel are unaccounted for. Before Thorpe could respond, Stone gestured to administrative officer who distributed new documents. Before we continue, I'm entering additional evidence. Comprehensive performance analysis of selection program over past 3 years. Victoria watched understanding dawn on Thorpe's face as he realized scope of evidence extended beyond single incident. Stone continued. This analysis reveals statistically significant pattern of female candidates and male candidates who voice support for integration being eliminated at rates far exceeding their peers despite equivalent or superior performance metrics. He looked directly at Thorpe. More specifically, Sergeant, candidates under your supervision show 72% washout rate for female trainees, compared to 23% for male trainees with equivalent qualification scores. When we control for physical capability differences and adjust for gender norm standards, this pattern remains statistically impossible without deliberate interference. Thorpe straightened. Different physical capabilities require different assessment approaches, sir. This analysis controls for those variables, Sergeant, Stone interrupted, steel in his voice. We compared candidates against established standards for their respective categories. The disparate outcomes persist even when we account for every legitimate physical differential. What this demonstrates isn't rigorous evaluation. It's systematic discrimination. For first time, genuine uncertainty showed on Thorpe's face. Hearing recessed as panel reviewed performance data. When proceedings reconvened, Aldridge called Victoria to present findings. She stood, moved to central position, began systematic destruction of Thorpe's defense. My evaluation began with observation of training methodologies and assessment protocols, she said, activating display. Within first 48 hours, I identified several concerning patterns. Female candidates receiving disproportionate criticism for performance equivalent to male candidates. Modified obstacle configurations creating unnecessary exposure points. Evaluation criteria that appeared to shift based on candidate demographics. She advanced through evidence methodically. Photographs of Jennings's unauthorized post, GPS data showing modified coordinates, audio recordings revealing coordinated effort. The SEER exercise represented escalation from bias to active endangerment, Victoria continued. Candidates were deliberately directed toward hazardous terrain. When weather deteriorated beyond safe parameters, and exercise was officially suspended, 3 candidates were abandoned, with false report filed regarding their status. She turned to face Thorpe directly. This wasn't training rigor, Sergeant. This was deliberate sabotage that placed lives at risk to advance personal beliefs about who deserves to serve in special operations. Thorpe held her gaze. In that moment, Victoria saw something shift. from defensive calculation to something colder, more fundamental. The look of someone who believed absolutely in correctness of their position despite all evidence. "Major Callahan," he said, voice tight with controlled intensity, "with respect, you're evaluating field training through lens of political correctness rather than operational reality. I've served in special operations for 17 years. I've seen missions fail because physical limitations weren't properly assessed. I've seen good men die covering for teammates who couldn't maintain pace." He stood despite not being prompted. "Women don't belong in direct combat special operations, not because of bias, but because of biology. What you're calling discrimination is actually rigorous evaluation that protects future operational effectiveness and lives of operators who'll depend on these candidates." The argument hung in air, honest expression of belief that had driven Thorpe's actions. Victoria let silence extend before responding, her voice carrying absolute calm. "Sergeant Thorpe, I've participated in direct combat operations in Kandahar, Fallujah, and Afghanistan. I've extracted wounded personnel under fire, completed missions when male teammates were incapacitated, and maintained operational effectiveness in conditions that tested every capability I possessed." She paused. "My service record would be more extensive, but most remains classified because for years the military officially denied that women like me were doing exactly what you claim we cannot do." She advanced display to show her partially redacted service record, showing deployment histories and commendations without revealing classified operational details. "The question before this panel isn't whether women can perform in special operations. We've been doing so for decades in roles that were officially denied. The question is whether institutional bias will continue to systematically exclude qualified candidates based on preconceptions rather than demonstrated capability." Stone called for final recess before rendering preliminary findings. Panel withdrew to deliberate. Victoria stepped into hallway. Dalton joined her. "You did well in there," he said quietly. "Thorough, professional, unimpeachable. Evidence did the work. I just presented it. Don't undersell yourself. I've seen cases with solid evidence fail because prosecution couldn't connect facts to larger context. You made that connection perfectly." They stood in silence, watching base personnel move through daily routines outside windows. Soldiers who had no idea that in this building, precedents were being set that would affect military culture for generations. "What happens after today?" Dalton asked. "Depends on findings, but regardless of local outcome, congressional oversight ensures this doesn't get buried. Real question is whether military will implement systematic reforms or continue treating these as isolated incidents." "You're not very optimistic about institutional change." Victoria considered this. "I'm realistic about how long cultural transformation takes in organizations built on tradition. But I'm also stubborn about continuing to push for that change, even when progress seems impossibly slow." Dalton smiled slightly. "That's what made you good operator. Patience combined with absolute determination." Panel reconvened 30 minutes later. Stone's expression revealed nothing as he called room to order. Aldridge stood to deliver findings, reading from prepared document. "Based on evidence presented, including documentation of falsified reports, testimony from multiple witnesses, communication logs, and pattern analysis of program outcomes, this panel makes following preliminary findings." Room held collective breath. "Regarding Sergeant First Class Owen Briggs, we find sufficient evidence to recommend referral to special court-martial on charges of violating Article 92 of Uniform Code of Military Justice, specifically dereliction of duty for abandoning assigned candidates during field operations with severe weather conditions. In exchange for Sergeant Briggs's cooperation, we recommend negotiated sentencing parameters be considered." Briggs slumped slightly, relief and resignation mixing. Aldridge continued. "Regarding Master Sergeant Declan Thorpe, We find sufficient evidence to recommend referral to General Court-Martial on charges of violating Articles 92, 107, and 134 of Uniform Code of Military Justice. The evidence supports allegations of dereliction of duty, false official statements filed during active emergency, and conduct endangering welfare of personnel under his command. Thorpe's face remained stone, but his fist clenched tighter. Additionally, Aldridge said with additional gravity, during recess period, Master Sergeant Thorpe was observed approaching Major Callahan in hallway in what multiple witnesses characterized as attempt at intimidation. This conduct supports additional charge of conduct unbecoming a non-commissioned officer. Stone leaned forward. Master Sergeant Thorpe, you are hereby suspended from all instructional duties pending convening of General Court-Martial. You will surrender all program materials, access credentials, and training authority before departing this facility. Maximum penalties for charges recommended include up to 15 years confinement and dishonorable discharge. For first time, genuine emotion broke through Thorpe's composure. Not fear or remorse, but something colder. Expression of someone who believed absolutely that system was wrong, and he was right. He stood when instructed, gathered materials with mechanical precision. Before military police could approach, he turned to face Victoria one final time. Their eyes met across conference room, two soldiers from different eras and beliefs, separated by unbridgeable divide of values. Thorpe said nothing, but the look conveyed his message. This might be over for him, but the fight wasn't finished. Victoria returned his gaze with equal silence, her own message just as clear. She'd faced this resistance before, in Kandahar and Fallujah and dozen other places. She was still here, still serving, still pushing for change. And she'd continue long after Thorpe's career ended. Then he turned and departed, flanked by military police. Room remained silent for several seconds. Then Stone called for adjournment, and formal proceeding dissolved into professional conversations. Victoria gathered materials, feeling exhaustion begin to seep through adrenaline. But she also felt satisfaction, not at Thorpe's downfall, but at evidence chain holding up, at justice being served for 37 female candidates who'd been systematically eliminated. Lieutenant Ashford approached. Major, that was remarkable testimony. The way you connected individual incidents to systematic pattern, that's going to be studied in military justice courses. Let's hope it's also studied in leadership courses, as example of what not to do. Before Ashford could respond, Stone gestured for Victoria to join him in adjacent office. She followed. Stone closed door, then turned with expression that had shifted from judicial neutrality to something more complex. Major Callahan, your evaluation was supposed to last 6 weeks and produce report on assessment protocols. Instead, in less than 1 week, you've uncovered systematic discrimination, documented criminal negligence, and forced institutional reckoning that Pentagon leadership will be dealing with for months. Victoria maintained professional posture. Sir, I evaluated what I found. The evidence determined scope of investigation. I'm aware. He handed her sealed envelope bearing Pentagon markings. This arrived via secure courier an hour ago. I was instructed to deliver it immediately upon conclusion of proceedings. Victoria opened envelope, extracting single page of official correspondence on Department of Defense letterhead. She scanned quickly, then read more slowly. The letter outlined new initiative, comprehensive review of all special operations selection programs, encompassing Rangers, SEALs, Delta Force, Green Berets, Air Force Pararescue, every elite unit. The review would assess evaluation protocols, instructor qualifications, complaint processes, and outcome patterns. It would be conducted with external oversight, congressional visibility, and direct reporting to Secretary of Defense. And it would be led by Major Victoria Callahan, with appointment that came with immediate promotion to Lieutenant Colonel and authority transcending normal chain of command. Victoria looked up. They want me to take this nationwide. They want you to do what you just did here, but across entire special operations community, Stone corrected. Find problems, document thoroughly, recommend solutions that fix root causes rather than symptoms. That's going to create significant resistance. Thorpe has allies at Pentagon who share his views. I'm aware, which is why position comes with direct SecDef oversight and congressional backing. You'll have authority to compel cooperation and access to any records necessary. Victoria considered implications. This wasn't just career opportunity. It was chance to address institutional problems that had persisted throughout her entire service. But it also meant becoming permanent target, spending years fighting bureaucratic battles, sacrificing operational assignments for administrative warfare. Sir, before I respond, I need to know, what happens here at Fort Bragg in interim? Stone's expression shifted to satisfaction. I'm personally overseeing restructuring of assessment programs. First step is promoting Captain Ashford to Major and appointing her interim training director. Second step is comprehensive review of all candidates who washed out under Thorpe's supervision. Those with legitimate qualification will be offered opportunity to restart selection, including candidates from this week's exercise. Candidate Hawkins, Candidate Sullivan, and Candidate Flynn will all be reinstated immediately upon medical clearance. Their performance during actual survival situation demonstrated exactly the kind of competence we should be selecting for. Victoria nodded. I accept the assignment, sir, with one condition. Stone's eyebrow raised. Which is? Colonel Dalton joins review team as senior advisor. His institutional knowledge spans 4 decades of special operations evolution. That perspective is invaluable for understanding how current problems developed and what solutions might be sustainable. Stone considered briefly, then nodded. I'll make recommendation to Pentagon personnel. Given Dalton's reputation and your documented results, I doubt there will be objections. He extended his hand. Congratulations, Lieutenant Colonel Callahan. You've earned this assignment in rank. Now comes harder part, implementing systematic change in institution that's been resistant to it for decades. Victoria shook his hand. I'm familiar with difficult assignments, sir. This one just happens to be fought in conference rooms instead of combat zones. Don't underestimate the danger, Stone said seriously. The enemies you'll face in Pentagon politics can end careers just as surely as enemies in field. And they fight with bureaucratic weapons you can't counter with tactical excellence alone. Then it's fortunate I've had 20 years to develop bureaucratic skills alongside tactical ones. Afternoon sun painted long shadows across Fort Bragg parade ground as Victoria stood on headquarters steps, watching new generation of candidates run formation drills. Major Ashford commanded the formation with natural authority, her voice carrying across field with clear cadence. The formation was mixed gender, men and women running in synchronized precision. No special accommodations, no separate standards, just soldiers holding each other to objective performance requirements. This was what right looked like. Beside Victoria, Colonel Dalton observed with satisfaction. They'll never know what it took to get here, he said quietly. Victoria understood the multiple layers. The women who'd served in shadows before official recognition. The advocacy efforts dismissed for decades. The qualified candidates eliminated by bias. The institutional resistance requiring systematic documentation to overcome. They shouldn't have to know, she replied. That's the point. Future generations should take equality for granted. Dalton nodded, then turned to her. I was wrong about you, you know, about women in special operations. You've mentioned that. Worth repeating. When you first joined Delta, I had serious doubts. Not about your capability, I'd seen that demonstrated, but about whether system could adapt without breaking, whether integration would create more problems than it solved. He paused. What I've learned is that systems are like soldiers. They adapt when they must, not when it's comfortable. You force that adaptation, not through rhetoric or political pressure, but through undeniable competence and refusal to accept institutional limitations. I had help, Victoria said. You taught me most of what I know about navigating institutional resistance while maintaining operational effectiveness. I taught you tactics. You developed strategy. Dalton glanced at formation. That young man is going to have career opportunities that would have been impossible 5 years ago because you documented pattern and forced accountability. How many others will benefit from same systematic change? Depends on how successful the nationwide review is and how much resistance we face from those who share Thorpe's beliefs. Dalton extracted small device from his pocket. You'll need this for Pentagon assignment. Secure communications, encrypted data storage, emergency beacon that works in any conditions. Consider it graduation gift. Victoria accepted the device. Cold War technology? Updated with modern encryption, but built on proven fundamentals. Sometimes old approaches work better than new ones when reliability matters. They stood in companionable silence. The parade ground activity continued, daily training rhythms modified by incremental progress toward equality that should have occurred decades earlier. Candidate Flynn emerged from medical building on crutches, moving with determined mobility. He spotted Victoria and Dalton, altered course to approach. Major Callahan, he said, offering salute. Victoria returned. Just received notification that I'm cleared to restart selection once medical hold is lifted. Wanted to thank you, ma'am. You earned it through performance, Candidate Flynn. What happened in those mountains wasn't simulation. It was actual survival situation, and you maintained discipline throughout. That's what selection is supposed to identify. Still, ma'am, without your intervention, he paused. Without your intervention, things could have ended very differently. Training environment should never put candidates at genuine risk through negligence or sabotage. What happened wasn't acceptable, and ensuring it doesn't happen again is exactly why I'm taking on this new assignment. After Flynn departed, Dalton turned to Victoria. You know what you're walking into, right? Pentagon assignment means years of bureaucratic warfare, different kind of battle entirely. I'm aware, Victoria replied, but it's the battle that needs fighting right now. Field operations established that women can perform. Now we need institutional structures that allow that performance to be properly recognized. You'll make enemies. Thorpe has allies who'll see your investigation as threat to their programs and careers. They'll use every bureaucratic weapon to obstruct and undermine. Victoria's expression hardened with determination that had carried her through 2 decades of service in environments designed to exclude her. Let them try. I've faced resistance my entire career. The difference now is that I have mandate, authority, and documented evidence that institutional problems exist. They can slow progress, but they can't stop it anymore. Dalton smiled slightly. Then I guess I'd better prepare for a few more years of active service. Someone needs to watch your six while you're fighting these battles. Thought you were retired. Was considering it, but this seems like better way to finish career, helping establish systems that will benefit soldiers for generations after we're gone. That's legacy worth pursuing. They turned back toward headquarters, where administrative processing for Victoria's new assignment waited. But before entering, Victoria paused one final time to look at parade ground. Ashford had dismissed formation, and candidates dispersed toward next activities. Among them, female candidates moved with same confidence and purpose as male counterparts, no longer marked as outsiders, but simply as soldiers pursuing qualification. Hawkins separated from main group and jogged toward Victoria. Ma'am, he said, slightly breathless, Major Ashford mentioned you're leaving for Pentagon assignment. Just wanted to say, what you did this week changed everything for those of us who believe standards should be about capability, not demographics. You proved that leadership means enforcing actual standards, not protecting bias disguised as tradition. Victoria studied young soldiers' face, seeing determination and moral courage. Candidate Hawkins, the standards you defended in that tactical station weren't about integration politics. They were about proper room-clearing procedures that keep operators alive. Your willingness to question flawed training design demonstrates exactly the kind of critical thinking special operations requires. Don't lose that quality, regardless of institutional pressure, to simply accept what authority figures tell you. Yes, ma'am, though I have to say, having authority figures like you makes it easier to maintain faith in system. After Hawkins departed, Victoria and Dalton entered headquarters, moving through corridors whose walls displayed decades of unit history. Photos and memorabilia told story of American Special Operations evolution. Soon, Victoria reflected, these walls would include visual record of another kind of evolution. Integration of women into roles once officially denied. Recognition of contributions previously classified into silence. Institutional change requiring systematic documentation to overcome resistance. She passed photograph from Mogadishu operation, circa 1993. Group shot of Delta operators. In background, barely visible, a figure whose gender was ambiguous in combat gear. Ghost 6, before that call sign became attached to Victoria. Next photograph showed Afghanistan operation from 2014. Another background figure, another officially denied contribution. Pattern had persisted for decades. Women serving in combat roles while military structure officially claimed they weren't there. That pattern ended here, today. With documented evidence, public accountability, and systematic reforms backed by senior leadership commitment, Victoria entered office that would serve as temporary workspace. Dalton settled into chair with comfortable familiarity. "So," he said, "what's your first move?" Victoria pulled out tablet. First step is comprehensive data collection across all special operations programs. Washout rates by gender, evaluation patterns, complaint histories, instructor backgrounds. Build statistical baseline that either confirms Fort Bragg was isolated incident or demonstrates systematic pattern. You already know what data will show. I have hypotheses based on Fort Bragg evidence and anecdotal information. But successful institutional change requires comprehensive documentation, not just extrapolation from single case. We need to demonstrate pattern is service-wide before we can implement service-wide solutions. Dalton nodded approval. And when data confirms your hypotheses, then we begin systematic intervention, revised evaluation protocols, enhanced oversight of instructor conduct, streamlined complaint processes, and most importantly, transparent reporting that makes patterns visible to congressional oversight and public scrutiny. Institutional change requires eliminating shadows where discrimination can hide. That's going to generate significant resistance from program leadership who've built careers on current systems. Yes, Victoria agreed calmly, which is why we'll need to move quickly once data is compiled. Implement changes before opposition can organize effective defense, and maintain absolute documentation standards so resistance can't undermine findings through procedural challenges. She looked up from tablet, meeting Dalton's gaze. This isn't going to be quick or easy. It's going to require years of sustained effort, political navigation through Pentagon bureaucracy, and willingness to make enemies among senior officers who benefit from status quo. But it's also going to establish foundations that will benefit soldiers for generations. Sounds like worthy final mission for old soldier, Dalton said. When do we start? Official assignment begins Monday. That gives us 3 days to prepare initial assessment framework, identify key personnel for team recruitment, and establish secure workspace at Pentagon. Victoria allowed slight smile. Also gives us time to celebrate this week's victory before diving into larger campaign. Dalton raised eyebrow. You planning to celebrate? That seems out of character. Sullivan's Bar, tonight at 1900 hours. Major Ashford, the candidates who survived exercise, and select others who contributed to successful investigation. Nothing excessive, just acknowledgement of work done well under difficult circumstances. And tomorrow? Tomorrow we start preparing for next battle. Because as you noted, they'll never know what it took to get here unless we continue pushing until equality is so well established that future generations take it for granted. Dalton stood, moving toward door. I'll see you tonight then. And Victoria, what you did this week wasn't just successful investigation or tactical victory. You changed trajectory of military culture in ways that won't be fully apparent for years. That matters more than any single combat operation, because it affects every operation that comes after. After he departed, Victoria sat alone, processing week's events with analytical precision. 7 days ago, she'd arrived expecting routine evaluation that would produce standard report. Instead, she'd uncovered systematic discrimination, documented criminal negligence, forced institutional accountability, and established foundation for nationwide reforms. Not bad for first week. Her secure phone buzzed with encrypted message. Congratulations on promotion and new assignment. Congressional Oversight Committee briefed on Fort Bragg findings. Significant interest in expanding investigation scope. Full resources authorized. Expect resistance from traditionalist faction, but you'll have backing at highest levels. Make this count. Victoria deleted message per security protocols, but implications remained. She had authority, resources, mandate, and congressional support. Everything necessary to implement systematic change. All she needed was same determination that had carried her through Kandahar firefights and Helmand Province survival situations. Absolute refusal to accept that institutional barriers were immutable. She stood, straightening uniform with practiced precision, moved to window overlooking parade ground, where new generation continued training under leadership that valued capability over demographics. Sun was setting over Fort Bragg, painting sky with colors that reminded Victoria of dozens of sunsets witnessed from forward operating bases across 3 continents. Each sunset had marked survival through another day, another mission, another challenge overcome. This sunset marked something different, transition from tactical operations to strategic campaign, from proving individual capability to establishing institutional frameworks that would benefit thousands of soldiers who'd never know her name. That anonymity was fine. Ghost 6 had always operated in shadows, but the reforms she'd implement would stand in full light, documented and defended, and made permanent through systematic change that couldn't be buried or dismissed. Victoria checked her watch. 90 minutes until celebration gathering. Enough time to complete preliminary framework for Pentagon assignment and send secure notification to key personnel who'd form core of investigation team. The work was just beginning, but for first time in her 20-year career, Victoria had resources and authority to match her determination. The steel commandment that had guided her through 2 decades, competence over prejudice, capability over bias, demonstrated performance over institutional assumption, would now be encoded into evaluation protocols and enforced through systematic oversight. Not because it was easy or comfortable, but because it was right. And because soldiers like Hawkins and Sullivan and Flynn deserved institutions that measured their worth by what they could do, not by demographic categories that had nothing to do with operational capability. Victoria turned from window, sat at her desk, and began typing first operational order of her new assignment. The Ghost had become architect, and the systems she'd build would outlast any resistance traditionalists could mount. Outside, the sun completed its descent. Fort Bragg's lights came on one by one, illuminating base that had witnessed generations of transformation. Tonight would mark another transformation, from individual victory to institutional reform, from tactical success to strategic campaign that would reshape special operations culture for decades to come. Victoria saved her document, secured her workspace, and prepared for the celebration that would acknowledge this week's achievement before tomorrow's larger mission began. The Steel Commandment would prevail, not through force, but through undeniable evidence, systematic documentation, and absolute commitment to principle that capability mattered more than prejudice. Always.